Dear friends, in this chapter we would be looking at pre-independence attempts at welfare legislation by the Britishers. During the first half of the 18th century, the British had established a trading presence in India. This had been achieved at considerable cost to the British, and they had initially only been merchants. Thereafter, they began to wage wars, and their victories led to acquisition of both commercial and military power in eastern and southeastern India. Until the 1750s, the British had not exercised political power in India. However, acquisition of political control necessitated that the British establish social and political institutions which would aid in their governance in India. Whereas the British had established pre-colonial institutions over time, these were finally modified into proper institutions of the government. Tracing the history and developments in social policy of the British in India would be an important step in understanding today's welfare legislations. We must understand that the advent of modernity was at the same time as the Britishers' advent in India. The Britishers were coming from a different culture, and they, at least at that time, had a different overview of the world. Many practices which were deeply entrenched in Indian society were found to be perverse by the British people. However, they were often hesitant in taking very proactive measures, as the same were bound to cause great disturbance in the Indian society. In spite of this, the Britishers, who had a spirit of trying to change the places they went to, they had a spirit of civilizing the so-called uncivilized nations of the world, what they also refer to as the white man's burden. In this spirit, they often took many steps to change the way Indians lived their lives. While many of these steps were motivated entirely by the selfish desires of the Britishers, some of these steps were actually aimed at improving the lot of some of the members of Indian society. Many scholars have adopted the view of the British state being a monolithic entity, which possessed the power to influence changes in the Indian society. The scope of social policy is very wide, and it includes within its ambit law, crime and society, family law, education, social information collection, and other forms of state interventions. It is not true that the Britishers had complete power to influence changes in Indian society. While they were powerful, their power extended almost entirely to the secular areas or the non-religious areas of the existence of Indian society. Religion very strongly had a place in Indian society, and the Britishers were hesitant of touching the same. Bengal, where the company government's headquarters were based, also contained a large number of educated middle-class persons who played an important role in the evolution of colonial policies. The upper classes of Bengal had received exposure to Western education, which further facilitated the close development of their cultural and social relations with the British. On the administrative front, the British sought to replace the existing aristocracy with a full-fledged bureaucratic and military-led administration set up for ensuring the effective enforcement of law and order. This class of bureaucracy was encouraged to be well versed in Indian languages and to uphold the Indian customs. In fact, Warren Hastings, who was the first Governor General of India, also emphasized on the need for creating social communication with the subject population, which was advantageous to obtain knowledge about the ruled. Thus, civil servants were educated in Persian and Hindustani before they commenced their tenure in India. The translation of valuable Indian texts of a variety of subjects were undertaken by civil servants and writers. During the tenure of Hastings, the development of cultural and social policies was directed towards understanding the subject population, their traditions and customs, as well as establishing a relationship with them, was sought to be understood. This underwent a change in the form of the British adopting a more interventionist approach towards policy formulation in India. Post the tenure of Hastings, the policies of the British government underwent a change and adopted a more interventionist approach towards social institutions in British India. It was believed that Indian society was backward and its social customs were retrograde. It was opined that there was a necessity to make Indian society more modern and progressive. Apart from challenging the customs, certain influential British individuals such as William Wilberforce questioned the religious beliefs of the Hindus, labeling them as being very superstitious people. It would be relevant to examine the interventionist policies adopted by the British and to analyze their impact. Why would the British think that the ways of life of Indians, the religion of Indians, was backward? And what would cause this abrupt change from initially trying to understand the society to later trying to change it? If you look at the international atmosphere at this time, you would find that this was a time when Europe was undergoing immense changes. It was undergoing changes which were leading it towards modernity. It also had undergone serious technological transformations, serious legal transformations, and democracy had begun to flourish in Europe. At that time, it was thought that the countries which the Europeans came to rule because of their superior naval power, because of their control of resources, were actually backward, and their ways and means were ways and means of the unknowledgeable people. They sought to change it. This mode of thinking became stronger as time went by, and the control of Europe over the world, over the rest of the world, became stronger and stronger. Around 1900s, at the peak of Victorian England, it was thought that the British Empire was never to be removed from its position of eminence. It was also thought that the white people, the white race, the race of the people with lighter color skin, was born to change, and it was the master race, and it had a burden to civilize the uncivilized people of the East and those of the darker color skins. We will now look at certain legislations, certain steps taken by the British government to change things in India. While the preceding discussion might make you think that the British were intervening and trying to change each and everything in India, it is not true. While certain steps taken by them might be seen to be actually subversive of Indian culture and putting it in the negative light, but there were certain steps which actually tried to correct India of its deep-seated, long-standing problems. An example of this is the practice of sati. You know what the practice of sati was. It involved a woman being burnt alive on her husband's funeral pyre. It was a practice which was widespread, particularly among the higher castes. There were other issues also, such as female infanticide. We will now look at some of these issues, and we'll try and see how did the British government intervene to correct these issues. Infanticide. Female infanticide was widely prevalent in northern and western India during the 18th century. It was largely reported among various castes, including the Rajputs, the Jats, the Ahirs, the Gujars, and the Khatris in the north, and the castes of Patidars and Kunbis in Gujarat, who resorted to the method of starvation or poisoning to kill the newborn girl child. The primary cause for the wide prevalence of this practice was the high expense, including dowry, involved in the marriage of the girl child. There was no uniform policy adopted by the British administration for curbing the evil of infanticide during the 18th and the early 19th century. At first, the practice was sought to be curbed through the imposition of penal sanctions against the land-owning Hindu castes who engaged in this practice. However, it was determined that neither penal sanctions nor the method of coercion produced any effective results. Finally, the law which abolished infanticide was enacted as Regulation 6 of 1802. In spite of several measures taken by the British to end this social evil, it was not very effective. The primary reason was that unlike sati, female infanticide was not practiced in public, and within a few hours of the delivery the female infants were killed. At this juncture, you only need to look at the modern Indian society, where female infanticide is still widely prevalent. If with today's technology, with today's widespread governmental resources, it is impossible to stop infanticide, it must have been much more difficult at that time, when it was not possible to find out if something had been done to kill a female infant. This made it difficult for the administration to register and keep record of infanticide cases. Furthermore, after the enactment of the statute abolishing sati, was reported that the banned practice of female infanticide had been replaced by neglect of the girl child. We can see that while the Britishers did take important steps towards removal of infanticide, it was not possible to completely root out this social evil. The reasons were simple. There were strong cultural factors affecting this behavior of people. While some threats can work, some other threats cannot work, because the reasons behind such practices are deep-seated in the communities which practice them. Even today, we find an abysmal child sex ratio in the northern parts of India. It is a grave matter that even after attaining independence for so long, and even after making impressive strides in economic field, why is it that even the most developed states of India continue to practice this heinous crime? Let us now look at the practice of sati. Perhaps the most inhuman of practices prevailing in India was the practice of sati. As I have said to you earlier, sati involved burning a live woman on the funeral pyre of her husband. During the 18th and 19th century, it was practiced in India in a very wide fashion. It was not just restricted to the Brahmin castes, but included within its ambit members of other castes as well. Unfortunately, no initiative had been taken to put an end to such a heinous practice. As cases of widow burning came to the knowledge of the British, they sought to conduct surveys on the prevalence of this practice in Calcutta. The British administration also sought to determine as to what extent this practice was based on the Hindu tradition. While the Pandits concluded that this practice was not permissible in accordance with religious texts, the court held that making any imposition on the Hindus in this regard would cause great dissatisfaction. Finally, due to the pioneering work undertaken by Raja Ram Mohan Roy during 1819 and 1821, the contention of the court, as stated above, was contended, and it was asserted that the absolute abolition of this inhuman practice was necessary. Finally, the government, led by Sir William Bentinck, the Governor General, legislated on the issue of widow burning, banning the practice. Initially, this legislation was applicable to the Bengal Presidency only, but later it was extended to include the Madras and the Bombay presidencies. Sati incidents have been reported in India as recently as about 20 years ago. It is widely believed that though they are not coming to the fore, it is a practice which, though it has been reduced in form severely, there are very few instances of it, but at certain places it is still practiced. What are the causes which cause live women brimming with life, to burn themselves on the pyre of their husbands? There are strong cultural reasons which cause people to do things such as these, and the result is a society which looks inhuman to outsiders and leaves a grave dent in those who live in it. Let us now look at the issue of slavery. Slavery, in the form of bonded labor, mainly due to default in payment of debts, was widely prevalent in India. the practice was denounced in British India. There were many forms of the practice of slavery, which included sale of slaves brought into the country from Arabia and Africa, slaves hired for engaging in agricultural production. Slaves in India were mostly comprised of economically backward classes who were in debt or those who, due to poverty, were forced to offer themselves to the slave market. While the British government was opposed to the prevalence of this inhuman practice, it did not take any immediate measures for the abolition of slavery. According to the Charter Act 1832, the administration was instructed to ensure an improvement in the conditions of the slaves, but it was not asked to end this practice. They were also required to initiate legal measures for abolishing this practice. An anti-slavery legislation was sought to be prepared by the Law Commission in 1841, and the government was requested to conduct local level inquiries into the practice. Finally, the Regulation 4 of 1832 relating to the prohibition of interprovincial movement of slaves was passed, and although it was anticipated that such a measure could lead to public agitation, no activities were reported. Finally, through the Act 5 of 1845, slavery was sought to be officially abolished in India. With the creation of other means of livelihood through proliferation of plantation agriculture and public works, eventually slavery was abolished in India. However, we must understand that even today, certain forms of slavery, such as Begar, continue to be practiced. Recently, in 1983, the Supreme Court passed a judgment called the Bandhua Mukti Morcha judgment, wherein it was stated that the practice of slavery needed to be weeded out completely, whether it be in the form of giving insufficient wages or keeping people bonded in eternal servitude. It is a continuing problem, though it always acquires a different face. Let us now look at the issue of education. An important contribution of the British was the introduction of Western education in India. Macaulay formulated the Minute on Education in 1835, which sought to introduce Indian society to Western rationalist thought. Prior to the introduction of English, the accepted language of the court of the Mughals was Persian, while higher education was given in Persian and Sanskrit. Although Warren Hastings was himself well versed in Sanskrit and Persian and encouraged scholars to gain knowledge, Macaulay was skeptical of the study of the Orient. He criticized the study of Indian and Arabic literature as being less valuable as compared to English literature. Thus, a strong advocate of English education, he emphasized on the need to create a class of persons in India who were of Indian origin, but who could act as representatives of the British government and provide an interface with the masses. Such individuals were sought to be trained in English education, taste, and ideals. However, they were to act as interpreters between the British government and local persons. Although the British introduced English education in India, very limited efforts were undertaken to ensure the education of masses, including women and children. Furthermore, only 3 universities were established in the cities of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. However, these were not directly involved in teaching. The methodology used in higher education laid a very heavy emphasis on rote learning and examinations, with very little initiative being taken to promote analytical or independent thinking. During the 1920s, the Indian universities were provided with teaching faculties only for students pursuing their MA degrees. Indian education was focused towards providing literacy, and there was no scope for technical training of individuals. Another limitation was that since the higher education was imparted in English, there was very little effort to translate the English literature into the vernacular language. It has been argued that while education could have played an important role to encourage social mobilization and ensure the upliftment of suppressed classes of society, the same could not be achieved. We will now examine statutes relating to child marriage. The enactment of the Native Marriage Act, which is also known as the Civil Marriage Act, was the harbinger of legislative action to prohibit the practice of child marriage. The primary limitation was that the act did not extend to all communities. Finally, due to the concerted efforts of B.M. Malabari, a Parsi social reformer, the government passed the Age of Consent Act 1891, which sought to prohibit the marriage of girls who were under the age of 12 years. Thereafter, the Sharda Act was passed, which revised the age for girls to be 14 years and boys to be 18 years. This measure was further revised by fixing the marriageable age as being 18 years for girls and 21 years for boys. From the analysis of social welfare legislations and measures undertaken by the British, it can be adjudged that from being curious about Indian customs and traditions, the British administration became more conservative and skeptical in their evaluation. Most legislative measures adopted were positive steps towards eradication of evil. However, the interventionist approach in the social and religious practices in India had a limited impact on society. Through the abolition of sati and child marriage, serious efforts were directed to prohibiting the exploitation of women and girl children. But it has often been contended that the British failed to undertake constructive steps to uplift the condition of women through empowerment. The social condition of women did improve. However, it did not result in their socio-economic upliftment in society. Furthermore, as stated earlier, while the practice of female infanticide was abolished, the parents continued to mistreat their daughters and discrimination against the girl child continued. We have to understand that this was not a failure on the part of British policymakers alone. This was a failure as much on the part of Indian society, and till this day we continue to reap the ill effects of these practices. Education played an important role in the transformation of society and thinking, at least among certain elite sections of the society. Due to personalities like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Keshav Chandra Sen, Dwarkanath Tagore, there emerged people who challenged certain policies of the British and played an instrumental role in initiating social welfare measures in India. The ideals of social welfare and equality of all individuals had inspired these middle and upper class Indians to question existing beliefs and endeavor to eradicate retrograde practices. Another leading reformer, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, also began a movement for supporting widow remarriage, which finally resulted in the British passing a legislation to bring the same into effect. Apart from fighting other social concerns such as child marriage and polygamy, he made concerted efforts for the formal education of both women and children. These leading reformers sought to introduce reforms in religion, challenge superstition, vandalism, and prevailing customs. In spite of their concerted efforts, they could not extend their reforms to all parts of the country, and their ideologies came to influence only a certain section of the Indian intellectual elite. Thus, tracing the development of the role of the British in framing social policy in India, it can be concluded that the colonial rule played a limited role in introducing changes which affected the mass of the population. Through the enforcement of legislative sanctions against the practices, including eradication of dacoity, remarriage of widows, enactment of a penal code, and enforcement of certain basic tenets of equality among caste groups, apart from the customs discussed earlier, the British sought to impact both law and society. While they might not have entirely succeeded in it, they definitely did lay down a groundwork on which the later legislations sought to improve. Therefore, the British policy can be seen to be the first step towards introducing modernity in Indian social customs.